You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is part 2 in a series of episodes about how to engage sorrow and grief in a way that brings healing. Let me begin by briefly summarizing the first episode. For most modern people, the place we find ourselves is in a land where grief and sorrow are unwelcome. In other words, most of us don't feel like the people around us can bear the depth of our sorrow and grief. And since we don't want to risk our sense of belonging, our sense of acceptance, we hide our sorrow and grief. But our sorrows, our griefs are real. And by grief, I don't merely mean sadness about the loss of a loved one. There are other types of sorrow and grief, and we talked about some of those in the last episode. For example, there have been moments in your life in which you needed to be seen, soothed, understood, validated, cared for, comforted, and you were not. Okay, your body carries grief about those very real losses. Then we began to address the question, all right, so what are we supposed to do with the sorrow and the grief inside? Because the reality is that most of us are so focused on what I called the ascent in the last episode, part 1. We're so focused on the ascent that we deny our sorrows. And when that doesn't work, we numb them as best we can. But as we saw in the last episode, there is an immense cost to denying and numbing our sorrows, our sadnesses, our griefs. And the cost is our aloneness. So, in many ways, the purpose of part 1 was to invite you to consider the importance of acknowledging, welcoming your sorrows. Which brings us to today's very important question, and that is this: what are the conditions needed to allow us to work with grief? What are the conditions needed to allow our sorrow and our grief to heal? And I'd like to suggest 4 conditions that need to be present. First, I'll tell you what they are, and then I'll explain each of them in detail. Number 1, we need to own that our sorrows and our griefs matter and that they should be taken seriously. That's the first condition. Number 2, we need to gradually move from a posture of contempt toward our sorrow and grief to a posture of compassion and kindness and welcome. Third condition, we need to find a few people who can be the village for us. This will allow us to risk sharing our sorrow and grief with other people. And 4, we need to move our bodies in a way that allows for the integration and release of our sorrow and grief. In other words, what am I talking about? Rituals. We need rituals to work through our sorrow and grief. Now, when these 4 conditions are present, when they're met, we can metabolize our big feelings of sorrow, sadness, grief. When these 4 conditions are present, there is a place for our sorrow and grief to go so that we can experience healing. Okay, let's look at these 4 conditions in more detail. In order to feel our sorrow and grief, in order to metabolize it, to work it through, we first need to own that our sorrow matters and that it should be taken seriously. I mention Jeremiah 6 and 8 often because those texts are so very important to me, but boy, are they relevant right now. God is speaking to the leaders of Israel in these texts, and God says to the leaders, "You dress the wounds of my people as though they were not serious. Peace, peace, you say, when there is no peace." All right, that's Jeremiah 6 and 8. Now, sadly, this is what many of us do with our own wounds. We dress our sorrows as though they were not serious. We say, peace, peace, everything's fine. We don't take our sadnesses seriously. We don't take our heartache seriously, our disappointments, our pain. We do not tend to our wounds. Now, to be fair, one of the reasons that we tend to deny our sorrows, that we shove them into the basement of our heart, is because most of us are afraid of the depth of our sorrow. We are afraid of the immensity of it. We are afraid of what we might find there if we really connect with it, if we welcome it. Here's how Francis Weller puts it in his very helpful book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. He says, grief feels like it will never pass. This brings us great fear. We worry that this house of sorrow will be our final resting place, that our days will always be overcast, gray, and dulled by the sadness we carry. We have the sense that we are on a slow walk with no obvious direction. Now, boy, can I relate to that. In fact, recently, I was feeling some of my sorrow, some of my grief with my therapist, and my therapist was comforting me. And this is what I said to him in that moment. I said, it feels like we would have to do this every day for a year before your comfort would make a dent in the sorrow and grief I have inside. So I understand why you may be afraid to take your sorrows out and look at them. They may feel too big, but grief knows where to take us. Sorrow knows where to take us. Grief is not a dead-end emotion. It will take you someplace new if you let it, if you flow with it. Okay, that's condition number one. Condition number one for metabolizing sorrow and grief is you've got to take your hurting heart seriously. Number two, we need to gradually move from a posture of contempt toward our sorrow to a posture of compassion, kindness, welcome. Now, just humor me for a minute. Call to mind a sadness or a disappointment that you have, something you still feel pain about. It could be from yesterday or it could be from 30 years ago. Just call to mind some heartache that you still carry inside. Now, ask yourself, what is my posture toward this particular sorrow in my heart? In other words, what do I feel toward the fact that I'm still sad about this thing? Very often, we hate the parts of us that are still grieved about the friendship that ended, still heartbroken that our mother was so critical of us, still sad that we were excluded or mocked in middle school, whatever your story is, whatever the stuff is. We know that we are still sorrowful about this thing or that thing, but we hate ourselves for still being affected by it. The idea is, I should be past this by now. This shouldn't hurt anymore. Now, if you resonate with what I'm saying right now, then you have a fair measure of contempt toward yourself, contempt for your sorrows, for your wounds. And when you are ashamed that you are still hurt about something from your past, you will never risk sharing that hurt with another human being. Shame stops you from doing that. The essence of shame is the fear that I will not be welcomed and accepted if you know this thing about me. Shame is about not belonging. That's the essence of shame. If you knew this thing about me, you would not welcome me in relationship. You would not want to be friends with me. You would not want to be in my presence. Shame is about not belonging. So the second condition for tending well to our sorrows is you have to be moving from a posture of contempt toward your pain and sorrow to a posture of compassion and kindness. Now, just as an aside, just a brief aside, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the sorrow of God before moving to condition number 3. Yes, the sorrow of God. Why? Because very few people are aware that the capacity to feel sorrow and grief is part of what it means to be created in the image of God. Yes, your ability to feel your sorrows is part of what makes you a glorious creature created in the image of a glorious God. What do I mean? Well, consider these words from Isaiah 63. This text is talking about the rebellion of God's people, the Israelites. And this is what it says. In all Israel's distress, God too was distressed. In God's love and mercy, he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them all the days of old. Here's the critical part. Yet they rebelled and grieved his Holy Spirit. Okay, what we see here is that the Spirit of God feels grief and sorrow because of the rebellion and the betrayal of Israel, God's people. Yes, the Spirit of God feels grief and sorrow. Now, there's an Old Testament scholar, Terence Fretheim, and he wrote a book called The Suffering of God. And Fretheim points out that it is the holy God who is said to be grieved in this passage. He continues, it is not considered in the least incongruous to juxtapose grieving and holiness. It is God in all his godness who grieves. Okay, that's Terence Fretheim. Now, wow. I mean, did you get that? It is holy to grieve. Why? Because God, in all God's holiness, grieves. Often. What Isaiah 63 says is they rebelled, Israel rebelled and grieved his Holy Spirit. And God doesn't merely grieve over his pain related to Israel. It's not just about Israel. No, the holiness of God's sorrow, the holiness of God's grief goes back to the beginning of the world. Think about the flood story, Genesis 6-8. Most people think the flood story is about God's anger at the sinfulness of the world. Now, look, if you've listened to this podcast, you'll know I will be the first to admit that God feels anger, okay? But you do not see God's anger in the flood story. Oh no. Read it closely. What you see is God's anguish, sorrow, grief. In fact, here's what it says in Genesis 6 at the beginning of this story. The Lord saw that the evil of the human creature was great on the earth, and that every scheme of his heart's devising was only perpetually evil. And the Lord regretted having made the human on earth and was grieved to the heart. Grieved to the heart. This is absolutely fascinating. Right from the beginning of the Bible, we meet a God who is emotionally affected by the people that God created. In other words, God hurts. God aches. God sorrows. God feels the anguish of betrayal, and it causes grief. Do you know that you are created in the image of a God who is emotionally affected by the sin of others, by the betrayal of others? Might that mean that you too should be emotionally affected by the sin of others? Indeed, your sorrow and grief, your ache, oftentimes is your glory. It is part of what makes you holy. In fact, my favorite Old Testament scholar, I quote him all the time, Walter Brueggemann, bless his heart, he observes that a close reading of the flood story, quote, shows that God is not portrayed as an angry tyrant, but a troubled parent who grieves over the creation. God is not angered, but grieved. He's not enraged, but saddened. That's Brueggemann. And he goes on to say that the flood story is about the hurt that God endures because of and for the sake of his wayward creation. What distinguishes God, Yahweh, from every other God and from every other creature is God's deep grief. That's Brueggemann. Now, look, I could go on. The entire book of Jeremiah, for example, portrays God as a being with an immense capacity for holy sorrow and holy grief. So, we tend to have contempt for our sorrow and grief. We tend to want to hide it. We tend to be ashamed that we're not over it yet. But the Bible proclaims that our sorrow and grief are indeed holy because God is a God of immense sorrow and grief. Okay, that was a little bit of an aside, but I wanted to do it. Back to the conditions that are necessary to metabolize sorrow and grief. Number 3. Boy, this is a big one. We need to find a few people who can be the village for us. This will allow us to risk sharing our sorrow and grief with others. Here's a true sentence. For many of us, our greatest sorrow is that we were left alone in our pain. There wasn't anyone there to provide comfort, care, and containment for our big feelings when bad things happened. We were left alone on our bed that night. We were left alone to make sense of the bad experience as best we could with our 7-year-old brain or our 14-year-old brain. The human heart, mind, and body are incredibly resilient. They are designed to heal. However, when something bad happens to you, you need the attunement and containment of other people if your wounds are going to heal. Human beings are not designed to heal by themselves. Please hear this sentence. Human beings, this is God's fault. This is just how God made people. Human beings, the brain, we are not designed to heal by ourselves. What does this mean? It means you cannot heal with a Bible, a cup of coffee, a journal, and a good view out your window. Why? Because you're alone with your Bible, your cup of coffee, your journal, and your good view out the window. And God made you to need other people. You need to be seen, heard, held, comforted in the wake of a painful experience. For your brain to heal, you need to be seen, heard, held, comforted. In other words, to say it slightly differently, you need attunement and you need containment. When you don't have parents who attune to you and provide containment for your big feelings by holding you and comforting you, when you don't have that, then your brain cannot metabolize your sorrow. And your sorrow gets pushed out of awareness into the basement of your heart. Check out this sentence from Francis Weller. Here's how he puts it. Imagine the feeling of relief that would flood our whole being if we knew that when we were in the grip of sorrow, our village would respond to our need. O.M.G. Let me say that again. Oh my goodness. What a sentence, Francis Weller. Imagine the feeling of relief that would flood our whole being if we knew that when we were in the grip of sorrow, our village would respond to our need. I can feel the relief inside me when I think to myself, well, what if I knew deep inside that whenever I was in the grip of sorrow, whenever I was upset, other people in my community would respond to my need and help me through it. Now, when you are a child, the village includes at least your parents, but we were made to be comforted by more than our parents. We were made to be comforted, tended to, and taught, mentored by the elders of the community. The warriors, both men and women, who know how to use their power on behalf of the wounded. That's what an elder is. An elder is someone who has learned how to use their power on behalf of the wounded. And by the way, why? Why do the warriors of the community tend to and care for the wounded? Why? Is it because the warriors are all altruistic? Is it because they're nice? Sure, fine. But far more, it is because the warrior elders understand the reality that we are all connected. In other words, when one of us is hurting, it affects the collective, the community. When one of us is hurting, all of us are affected by it. That's what warrior elders understand. We are not individuals, okay? Skin is massively overrated in our culture as a membrane. When one of us has pain, that pain leaks out of your body, passes through your skin, and enters into the hearts and bodies of those around you. Let me quote a full paragraph from Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. He's addressing the question, what is needed for your body to process your sorrow and release it? And he is saying that one condition for the healing of sorrow is for other people to provide a safe container for the person in pain. Now look, this is a bit of a long paragraph, but I'm going to read it and then I'm going to summarize it. This is what Weller says. In the absence of real community, the safe container is difficult to find. By default, we become the container ourselves. And when this happens, we cannot drop into the well of grief in which we can fully let go of the sorrows we carry. We recycle our grief, moving into it and then pulling it back into our bodies unreleased. Frequently, patients tell me that they often cry in private. I ask them whether they ever allow their grief to be witnessed and shared with others. There is usually a quick report of, no, I couldn't do that. I don't want to be a burden to anyone else. And Weller continues, we need to recover our right to ask for help in grief. Otherwise, it will continue to recycle perpetually. Grief has never been private. It has always been communal. Subconsciously, last sentence, such a good sentence. Last sentence, subconsciously, we are awaiting the presence of others before we can feel safe enough to drop to our knees on the holy ground of sorrow. Okay, I know it was long, but boy, does it pack a punch. That's Francis Weller. Now, I'll summarize it. What's he saying? He's saying, look, it's difficult for us to find the village. It's difficult for us to find a safe container of people to hold our sorrow. And when the village of elders is not present, you, by default, become the container yourself. But it doesn't work. Why? Why? Because sorrow and grief cannot be fully metabolized and worked through without the caring presence of others. Just like you need attuned, empathic witnesses to engage your story, you likewise need attuned, empathic witnesses to heal from your grief and sorrow. You, we, I, all of us desperately need a village of warrior elders. Now, one more quote from Weller. It's shorter. All right, it's shorter. He's talking about our tendency to hide our sorrows from others, to hide it from other people. And here's what he says. We do not show our sorrows to anyone, and we thereby deny these parts of ourselves the healing salve of community. The proper response to any loss is grief, but we cannot grieve for something that we feel is outside the circle of worth. That is our predicament. We chronically sense the presence of sorrow, but we are unable to truly grieve because we feel in our body that this piece of who we are is unworthy of grief. Oh my gosh, a modern prophet. This is spot on. What's he saying? I'll break it down. First, he's saying that we don't show our sorrows to anyone. And as a result, these wounded parts of ourselves are denied the healing salve of community. We can't receive comfort if we won't share our pain with another, if we won't let someone else in. That's his first point. Second, Weller is saying that the proper response to any loss or disappointment is grief, sorrow, ache. But we cannot grieve for something that we don't feel is worthy of care and attention. This is why God indicted the leaders of Israel in Jeremiah 6 and 8. They didn't think the wounds of the people were worthy of care and attention. They dressed the wounds of the people as if those wounds were no big deal. My point is that we tend to do this very thing with our own sorrows and losses and disappointments. So, question for you. Do you believe that your sorrows, that your pain is worthy of care? Do you believe that your wounds from 30 years ago, maybe, from 2 weeks ago, that your wounds matter? That they matter enough to deserve care? And if not, why do you think that might be the case? That you don't believe your wounds are worthy of care? When the conditions for processing through your sorrow are not present, what happens is that your sorrows, your griefs, they get stuck in your body. And if you have a history of developmental trauma, it is almost guaranteed that you have sorrow stuck in your body. Why? How can I say that if I don't know you? Because the nature of trauma is that there was no space in your home for you to feel your feelings. It wasn't safe to feel them. There was no container for you, no empathetic witnesses, no elders, no warrior elders, i.e. parents, who knew how to use their power on behalf of the wounded. And the bottom line with big emotions, including sorrow and grief, is you have to feel it to heal it. You have to feel it to heal it. To heal your sorrow, you have to feel your sorrow. Another way of saying that, you have sorrow and grief inside that is unfelt. It's there. It's stuck in the basement of your heart. It's waiting for you to reach a new level of kindness and therefore welcome that grief into your conscious awareness. Think of it this way. Think of your sorrows, your aches, the stuff that's unwell inside. Think of those sorrows as people with stories to tell. All right, you want to welcome those people at your dinner table. Each one of them. Each one of those sorrows. Set a place at the table for them. Cook them a savory and nutritious meal, and then ask them what they need you to know. That is what it means to welcome your sorrows. And as we said earlier, once you have welcomed these sorrows and listened to them, then you need to share them with the village. That is, 2 or 3 elder warriors who know how to use their power on behalf of the wounded. Okay, final condition for healing sorrow and grief. Number 4, we need to move our bodies in a way that allows for the integration and release of our sorrow and grief. In other words, rituals. That's what we're talking about when we talk about moving our bodies. We need rituals to work through our sorrow and grief. And this 4th condition of participating in rituals to release sorrow and grief, it is so important and frankly so foreign to most of us that I'm going to devote the entirety of the next episode to the topic of why do we need rituals and how do we do them? Thank you so much for listening to today's episode.